have Todd bring up a couple of charts real quick. I want to talk about tax reform, and what we basically do is we reduce a lot of taxes. But before we reduce taxes, we have to talk about spending. Our two major parties have had a unique approach towards taxing and spending. The Democrats have advocated often tax increases in order to spend money. And I honestly believe that that is a more ethical and moral way to do it than what the Republicans have done, which is often to talk about tax cuts, which really they've advocated tax shifting, and then they keep spending the money, okay? Now, I don't support either approach, but I would rather, pay as you go than finance through debt. So, having said that, don't go yet, because we're going to hit the other chart real quick. Here's where our money goes as a state. Most people believe that education is where the largest percentage of our state expenditures go. But of the $14+ billion a year that we spend, the single largest portion is spent in the health and human services area. And we, in fact, are nearing 1 million unduplicated clients of the Department of Human Services. This is a staggering figure. This is in excess of 30% of the Iowa's population. Staggering, and those are unduplicated. It's not like when you go to the fair and they say we've had 1 million people and I went 4 days. This is one person, one number. So that's significant. Now, is there a way to scroll up a little, because I just want to touch on that. Education, of course, 25%, then we get, administration, but health and human services is the biggest category. Now, if you go down to page 74, now this figure also is significant, and just scroll up a little, because this has the numbers right here. Now, when we look at fiscal year 2014, and this is the most current data available, we actually see, again, some very significant numbers. More than 400,000 Iowans who are involved in Medicaid, enrolled in Medicaid on a monthly basis, and nearly 440,000 Iowans who are on the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, which we typically call food stamps. Now, when we look at Iowa as a whole, we have to understand that the government check is absolutely critical to the sustaining of the state as it is now. Now, when we talk about tax reform, we're going to talk about tax reform as the primary vehicle to take us from being a welfare state to being a self-sufficient free market state. But before we get there, we have to understand not only where our money is going, but the culture that this defines. Now, the New York Times had an article today about Iowans leaving the farm and concentrating in urban areas. And it made it sound like they're leaving the dull farm to come to the cool, hip, downtown, driven, awesome urban areas of Iowa. They never explored the fact that we've lost 2 congressional seats in the last 20 years, nor did they mention that in our urban areas, poverty is high and staggering. 62% of families with kids in the Davenport school district cannot feed them. 62% in the Sioux City School District, 67% in Waterloo, more than 70% in Des Moines, our capital city, the city that was reported glowingly in the New York Times. Yet, how can you have such an optimistic view when 70% of your families cannot feed their kids without the government sitting at the table, dishing out the food and providing it? So when we look at these numbers, and then we look at the fact that these numbers feed into a culture of poverty exploitation. It's not just that we have high poverty. It's that we have entire systems that have become dependent on either poverty-related financing or government funding. Now, we have government subsidies of ethanol, we have government subsidies of agriculture, we have government subsidies of education. We toured Genesis today. The fact is that when you look at Medicaid, it's not only a $3.6 billion program, but anywhere from 1/3 to 40% of that is required by Iowa taxpayers. So when you have Senator Grassley and Senator Harkin and Governor Branstad and Bob Vander Plaats on the right and Chet Culver on the left, not talking about how we reduce Medicaid dependency, but talking about how we reduce the reimbursement levels, increase the reimbursement levels for Medicaid and Medicare to rival that of California, it doesn't occur to people, and the medical industry is heavily dependent upon this, but it doesn't occur to people that if you increase the federal contribution to Medicaid by $500 million, then Iowans have to come up with another $250 million. So so we go back to that 41.5% welfare. And there's no meaningful conversation about reforming welfare in the state. And yet, when we actually look at the fact that this is where the largest part of our money is going, it's critical for us to talk about fixing this area. And there are several ways for us to fix this area that begins the process of us reducing what taxpayers have to pay so we can then fix the tax code. Because again, if we just simply start cutting taxes without cutting spending, that isn't a realistic and viable solution. That only contributes more to the problem. So we aren't going to spend a whole lot of time going into the weeds on how we reduce all those. I'll be glad to answer any questions. But we do save money in these areas that allow us to get to tax reform. Now, one other critical principle that we operate by. There's no such thing as free federal money. When we looked at them handing out cell phones, or we see a number of other programs, there is a concept among state house leaders, Republicans and Democrats, that federal money is independent and separate from Iowa. And so when we get federal money, regardless of how much it is or when we get it or why we get it, it's a good thing. But here is the fundamental problem with that mindset. The federal government has no money to send us. If they had money to send us, we would still have to have an honest and candid discussion about whether they should send it. But the fact that they're broke and in debt and have no money and have no way of getting money in 2014 to pay for 2014 expenditures requires us to have not only another conversation, but it ought to require us to have a fundamental change in how we think about this. When they pay for something in 2014 with a federal check, what really happens is that folks in Iowa call D.C., and D.C. calls China or Dubai, and then someone in China or Dubai gets into a sophisticated piece of equipment called a time travel machine. I know they have a time travel machine because when they return to be able to give us a check in Iowa in 2014, is because they have taken it from our children or our children's children. At that point, when we pay for reckless, irresponsible, wasteful government, it ceases to be just a fiduciary issue. It becomes a moral issue. Ought we be stealing from our children to pay for things that make no sense for us to pay for simply because of the greed, negligence, misfeasance, malfeasance, or dereliction of duty of elected officials at the State House, who often don't even understand what they're supporting. When we had our booth at the State Fair, I had a staffer of legislative leadership, and I was talking to them about the fact that legislators often don't read annual reports. He said, oh, it gets worse. We just tell them what to vote for, like appropriations, and they vote for it, and then 2 or 3 days later, we tell them what they voted for. This is how our tax dollars are being spent by leadership that often views themselves, the best of them, as lobbyists. I'm here for gun control. I'm here to fight shooting doves. I'm here to promote shooting doves. I'm here to stop abortion. I'm here to ensure abortion. Okay, you have a right as a citizen to have your own personal agenda. But when you enter the State House, you have a fiduciary responsibility to the $14 billion that is spent by state government. And not only are we seeing our leadership fail in their fiduciary responsibility, the governor has failed miserably. Now, real quick on the example of things that happen with welfare reform, and the job of a chief executive is to follow the law and to ensure the proper implementation of the law. I happen to take the Constitution seriously, both the federal Constitution and the state Constitution. Doesn't mean some things don't need to be changed, especially in the state Constitution. But a governor's job is not to be a legislator. So one example of how we save huge amounts of money by a governor doing his job is by requiring compliance with certain laws. This may sound harsh to some individuals. Do you remember when Joe Wilson said President Obama was lying a few years ago?
Yeah.
Do you remember why he said he was lying?
It was during the State of the Union address,
Right.
wasn't it?
Exactly. But do you remember why Joe Wilson said President Obama was lying? Because President Obama said, we will not provide benefits illegally to non-citizens. Now, we can get in a lot of different discussions about illegal immigration, humanity of it, the inhumanity of it, or whatever else. From an executive office perspective, there's only one option, and that is to comply with the law. So when we talk about the huge amount of monies we spend as part of that 41.5%, simply having a governor call up his executive officers who serve at his pleasure according to state law, you'll see it in the official registry, and instructing them to not award benefits without authentication of citizenship saves us hundreds of millions of dollars. How does that affect tax policy? The amount of money saved alone by that simple act of compliance dwarfs what we would generate with the gas tax. And this is an important principle for us. Everything we advocate, we pay for. Whether it's through generated revenue or taxes, or through reducing expenditures that allow us to shift our priorities. Now, there are other areas. In education, we spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year funding students that are non-existent. One of the areas we spend in, and you all saw the chart, is where we have this massive excess of bureaucracy. You weren't here, but I showed them a graph where we have 94 students in a school district with 38 staff. At the Regents level, we have fewer than 80,000 students with 45,000 staff. There's no question that we have these massive levels of bureaucratic access. And so as we begin the process of redefining the role of government, defining the role of government, and limiting the role of government, and do it in a common sense and reasonable way, we free up significant amounts of resources. So is it reasonable for us to have 38 staff in a school district of 94 students? And if not, by eliminating those, we then gain options. is it reasonable for us to have, and I used to carry the EE4 report for our Regents institutions. So when people say all that staff is the university hospital, it's not. It's not. So is it reasonable for us to have a law that requires 1 adult for every 10 4-year-olds, but to have a Regents institution with 1 adult for less than two college-age students? If not, then we begin reducing. And as we begin saving money and reducing expenditures, then we free up resources. One way we free up resources is to end our phony war on drugs for the poor, working poor, in this state. Again, we use the example of Dr. David England. He didn't go to jail. Governor Branstad's child got drunk and high, killed 2 people, and was sentenced to pay a $30 fine. Meanwhile, we have young people, a young man, I talked to a young man's father-in-law who called into my radio show I was on. His son-in-law did a 1.5 years for having an empty pipe in an ashtray on a routine traffic stop. So we're not going to have equitable justice. And when we talk about the economic impact of decriminalization, we talk about taking tens to hundreds of millions of dollars that are currently spent by our criminal justice system, our human welfare system, the disruption of the education of students, and we put that back into the plus line of the taxpayer. And so, again, we're freeing up resources. So once we've freed up sufficient resources, we can now have a conversation about tax reform. So, Todd, can you bring up page 47? And I don't know if there's any comment or question before we get to page 47.
The dreaded page 47.
Yes, 47. Question or comment before? Yes.
Yeah, you spoke, not greatly, you mentioned Medicaid a couple of times. Would a single payer system be part of something you'd support as part of the solution?
Well, I try not to focus on federal issues.
Well, it's not a federal issue if the state's having to lay out all this money for Medicaid.
Well, I think that, as it relates to fundamentally changing the system, because Medicaid is a federal program with some state subsidies. So we couldn't radically alter the way Medicaid's administered in Iowa. We can reduce dependency, we can change certain dynamics of it, but we can't just completely, we can't say you're still going to send the federal check, but we're going to create our own system. One of the ways that I found that
Then I'll ask some related, that's not necessarily, and yes, this is a federal question, but it would impact the state for those of us paying health insurance premiums. Would you support Medicaid for all?
No.
Because?
I think, first of all, I think that the conversation that we've had hasn't been a health conversation, it's been an illness maintenance conversation. Our conversation has been, how are we going to pay for the systems that they allow us access to? So we have this conversation about, should we go the Romney Care / Obamacare route, mandating coverage, et cetera, and then if they can't, we go on Medicaid, or should we have a single payer? And we almost never have a conversation about the $100 billion a year of Medicaid, Medicare fraud that the federal government acknowledges and documents every year. We almost never have a conversation about the systems that are utilized for folks to access. So when we look at Memphis, for example, as a city, they say, you know what, rather than taking a healthcare a route where we buy insurance and then pay these people what they tell us to pay, why don't we take and provide direct access to clinics and healthcare facilities, which significantly reduce the cost? So there are other options and ways to address these issues. We accept that either the government or the insurance company should pay $97 for a mucus recovery system.
Okay.
We rarely talk about whether we should be paying $97 for a box of Kleenexes.
Right.
And so we get caught up. It's like we got Republicans saying, well, health savings accounts, and it's like, wait, stop. Can we talk about this $97 for a box of Kleenexes? This is $47 for a bottle of aspirin. And until we have those conversations, how we're going to keep overpaying people who habitually overcharge us until someone's girlfriend or wife tells on them isn't where I want to begin. I got married in a hot air balloon in San Diego in January of 2013, and it crashed. And the woman I married was a chaplain at San Diego Hospice, and she got a concussion. But she couldn't get her sick leave because they went out of business right after that because they got busted for ripping off $200 million. She didn't rip it off, by the way. She was a chaplain. But they didn't get busted because federal auditors went in there and found the fraud. It's because they fired somebody who then blew the whistle on them. It's the same way the dude got busted for billing for 800 patients a day. He chose like his girlfriend and his wife wrote on him, or one of them. So until we have a conversation about what it is we ought to have, then we ought not have a conversation about how you're going to get paid. That's the battle.
Well, you've more than answered my question.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Is this the right page, John? 47?
It is, but let me just say this on Medicaid. There are ways to reduce Medicaid costs, getting people healthier. When we had groundbreaking health hearings a decade ago, there was a hospital staff that they created a program to get people healthy, diabetes education, nutrition education. I think it was in the Mason City area, it might have been Clear Lake. They did a phenomenal job. They started getting people healthy. Now, can anyone here tell me why the program was discontinued?
I'm not from Iowa, I can take a guess.
Why?
The sugar.
Well, it was discontinued because so many people got healthy that the hospital started losing money.
Oh, yeah, because it's big business.
Because there was no money in people being healthy. If we reduce Medicaid dependency by just 25% by creating healthier Iowans, then we not only save taxpayers more than $900 million, but we save Iowans somewhere between $300 to $350 million, which is $50 to $100 million more than we would generate through raising the gas tax by getting people healthy. That's not part of the conversation. That's not part of the conversation. Getting Iowans healthy as a strategy for reducing, emergency room access by changing the dynamics of where individuals can go. Now, where do individuals who are on Medicaid, what is their primary health care facility? The emergency room. So when you start changing those dynamics, when you start having health plans for individuals on Medicaid that transition them from Medicaid dependency to health, there are a number of things you can do to reduce those costs and reduce the dependency, almost none of which we utilize because the system is addicted to these dollars. So, taxes. Here's what we generate in taxes. Now, again, throughout this document, you will see sometimes where they have 2012, 2013, and 2014 numbers. And there's nothing we can do about it because we can't make up our own data.
And what is this document?
This is Iowa Fiscal Facts, and it's the 2013 edition. So this is what we generate in terms of personal income tax. This is what we generate in terms of sales tax.
What are those amounts?
$3,786,000,000, $2,538,000,000, and granted, between 1/6 to 1/7 of this amount goes towards school construction, which we were talking about. Now, because some counties have 7% like Scott, some have 6% like Polk, it varies. But 1 penny out of every time you pay a sales tax dollar, pay sales tax on $1, a penny goes towards school construction. And then here's the corporate income tax, and I want to begin there. Again, when we look at the farm, ethanol, the medical field, education, construction, transportation, and go down the line, the government dollar is present in Iowa. We have very few industry in our state that are sustained independent of government injection. And if you just suddenly yank that out and withdraw it, then the question is, can our state economy survive? So we actually phase out and reduce a number of taxes, but we began with the corporate tax. It's $511 million. A lot of times when you talk about phasing out or eliminating the corporate tax, individuals freak out because they don't actually know the amount of the tax. They're vested in the concept of the tax. We should be taxing corporations because they're big, bad, evil things, and we should be taxing them. And most people don't even understand the nature of corporate taxation, particularly at the state level. Now, this might be a different conversation at the federal level, but at the state level, it's a very simple conversation. If companies don't house their profits here, then they're not paying those taxes. Second, corporate taxes, as they're currently structured, merely are a conduit that allows the people who control the company to decide who will actually pay that tax. When we talk about a corporate tax and Walmart, Christy Walton is worth $35 billion. She's not paying this tax. Corporate taxes either tax profits, wages, prices, or future growth and expansion. They're not taxing profits when it comes to Walmart. She grew from $25 billion to $35 billion in a very short period of time. So what are we talking about in Iowa when we talk about corporate taxes? Todd, are you incorporated?
LLC.
Okay, well, when small business people incorporate because their accountants and lawyers tell them to protect themselves against random circumstances like someone suing them, they're now paying this tax. When you're a small business person paying this tax, you're not able to put that money in your profits and cancel health insurance for part-time workers like Walmart just did. Because Christy needs to get the $40 billion, okay? She needs to get the $40 billion. So your health care is gone, workers. No, when you're a small business person, you have to make a choice. You can't cut wages or your workers quit. Go work for someone else. You can't raise prices because people go somewhere else. So you have to choose either between putting it in your pocket and spending it on your family, or you have to choose to not grow your business. So when we phase out this tax, and remember, we cut a lot of spending. So we're not actually, we're still on the plus side even after we phase this out. We not only help small business people, who in many instances are working for the landlord. We talk about in our economic presentation, urban sharecroppers, who either working for the landlord, the government, the insurance man, their employees, and lastly for themselves, or the bank. So when we phase that out, we do a few things. One, we help small businesses. But two, we now have created a corporate climate that encourages people to come and headquarter in Iowa because they now have a favorable tax code for their businesses. So we may not be taxing them for their profits, but we're attracting them and the investment, the growth, the jobs that they bring with them. Now, we don't just automatically do this year one. We phase it out over a 3 or 4 year period, maximum of 5 year period. But this is where we begin because we want to jumpstart the free market engine. Now, the second place we go is property taxes. Now, property taxes really aren't on here because of the state. They're in another chart, and I don't want to spend the time to find them. But property taxes in Iowa right now are not only in many instances, determined randomly by assessors who base them upon the size of the budgets they want to spend. But property taxes in Iowa create a caste system that is detrimental in urban areas, and they create a powerful disincentive that accelerates urban sprawl in other parts of the state. So let's begin with urban areas. I live in the Drake University area in Des Moines. Young couple buys a house in the Drake area. Now, he graduates from college, he gets a good job. She graduates from college, she gets a good job. They want to invest in the home. If they invest in the home, their taxes go up and their neighbors' taxes go up. So when they want a nice new home, what do? They move to Beaverdale. Or they move to Urbandale, or they eventually move to West Des Moines, or maybe to Waukee. And so what ends up happening is, instead of having individuals who are building their communities, we're accelerating their going to different communities, and they're not investing. They're not stabilizing the schools in their community. They're not building little leagues in their community. They're not building neighbors and kids who bring back grandkids in their communities. And so we end up with an urban caste system. So Clark and Washington and College in Des Moines always stay blighted. Beaverdale always attracts young, middle-aged couples, and West Des Moines ends up being a center of prosperity. By changing the tax code to link property taxes to purchase price instead of randomly assessed values, now when individuals move into these communities, if they stay in these communities and build on, not only don't their neighbors' taxes go up, but they can build without fear of severe tax bills. If they leave those communities, then they pay the new taxes on their new purchases, which causes it to go up. We saw this work well in stabilizing some neighborhoods in California. We also...
So how do you turn that away? Because I happen to know the Scott County, the old assessor here, and we had quite a conversation on who makes up the assessment value. What magical number does that come from?
Well,
they never turn it back.
Well, I've often
They
said...
get used to those monies, they're never going to turn it back.
Absolutely. I've often said that when the assessor gives you the value of your home, you should be able to say so. You should just have to buy it. It really is worth that much? Cool.
But that's my point,
Sure,
is they get used
but-
to those
but-
monies, they're never gonna turn back the map.
Well, and this requires a constitutional remedy, because even if you don't fix up your house, if your neighbor fixes up their house, your property taxes can go up. Also in urban areas, this is a disincentive to certain small businesses. In a rural community, if you fix up Main Street, you get a severe tax bill. In urban areas like Des Moines, Waterloo, Davenport, Cedar Rapids, there is a dragon that consumes small businesses whole. If you have Happy Joe's on Southeast 14th and McKinley in Des Moines, and you've been there 20 years, and now Walmart becomes your neighbor to the south, and Home Depot and Best Buy become your neighbor, catty corner to the west, you know what you're called? Out of business. Because there's no way you can survive the property tax increase that's been introduced into that area. You just can't survive it.
I'm confused on that.
Well, you have a neighbor who moves in whose property is worth this much, and then that forces your property to go up to here.
But don't they go in only the TIF districts?
No, that's for...
They only do that in Illinois, I guess.
Well, no, you have tax increment.
They're all over the place.
No, you have tax increment finance districts, but those tax increment finance districts are used on the front end of development, and then they really don't impact you as a small business person. Walmart may have what they consider a low property tax level, but as Walmart's neighbor, that property becomes so valuable that you can't afford to keep it
Okay.
and pay the taxes on it. And so we've seen again and again, small business people crushed under the weight of this.
So what's the change? I mean, how do you change that?
Well, and what we're proposing is changing changing property tax.
The formula?
So the property tax absolutely is based upon the purchase price. If you pay $100,000 for a piece of property, and let's say the tax is 1% or 1.2% or 1.5%, then if your property is $100,000 and you pay 1% on that, you pay $1,000 on it. 5 years later, you've invested in it, you built it up, you fixed it up. What's your property tax 5 years later, Todd?
1,000.
$1,000. This creates an incentive for individuals to invest, revitalize urban communities, which are being just torn down and ripped down and plundered, versus what we do, it encourages revitalizing, rebuilding, reinvesting in those properties instead of tearing them down, because you pay less taxes if you have nothing on it than if you have a perfectly good building on it.
So
Which
how
also
do you
encourages.
get that to happen?
We have to change that in the Constitution, our Constitution.
So.
But the important thing is should we change?
And there's a constitutional amendment opportunity for a constitutional amendment every 20 years.
No, there's an opportunity for a constitutional convention every 10 years.
10.
We actually can propose constitutional
Same as
amendments through the legislature. They just have to pass them 2 successive sessions, and then it goes on the ballot. So this is the kind of reform that could be there as soon as 2016 election.
That's what we have in Illinois right now, 5 of them on there also. But what you're talking about there though, I like your idea about that, because usually within 15 to 20 years, whenever that TIF runs out, Walmart leaves, the building's empty, does the property tax go back down then?
Well, the
See what I'm saying?
property tax value, value of the property might go down, but it's irrelevant because you've already been put out of business. Because if your neighbor, see in Iowa,
Well,
if you fix your
Happy Joe's
property,
Pizza is such a great pizza. I mean,
if you
Joe's from,
listen,
across the area.
if you fix your property in Iowa, your taxes go up. But if your neighbor fixes his property, your taxes go up too. So this is problematic.
But they're also handed a number that they need to meet. So that was my argument, is they're given this magical number here.
Absolutely.
They have to figure out a way to meet, so they go out and they just figure it all out, and I was like, okay, that's,
And you know what this does? It takes this out of the hands of assessors.
exactly.
But here's the other thing that happens. So in urban areas, we keep pushing out to the suburbs and keep pushing out the new development. This tax law, again, it's not just that this tax is unfair and reckless. What this tax says is, stay long enough to take advantage of TIF, and then move your new business to a new TIF district.
That's what I'm saying.
Then
yeah.
move your business to a new
Yeah.
TIF district. And it leaves behind a wake of abandonment and sprawl, destroying also our rich farmland. It's devastating our urban communities and creating them into high poverty zones. But what it's also doing to our rural communities, in our rural communities, we already have sidewalks, roads, poles, and sewers, and fire hydrants, and buildings that are often built very, very well. I talked to a property owner in Dickinson County, he owns property in Dickinson and Clay County and a couple other counties. He put money into a downtown development. He got a $10,000 tax bill before he made a penny. So if you invest in these communities, these dying rural areas, you're punished severely. But if you go pour concrete on a rich black soil, not only do you get a tax increment finance district or a tax credit or a literal check for cash, but you also then have the government coming in, putting in roads and poles and sewers and fire hydrants at extraordinary expense to taxpayers. So this is why we've said the second area of tax reform that is critical is property tax reform. Because if we don't reform our property taxes, it's not just that you're subject to randomly assessed values, but these property taxes are dictating the very nature of how we're cannibalizing our soil and leaving behind urban and rural desolation.
John, you've got 2 more areas of tax reform, sales tax and individual income tax,
Right.
correct?
Exactly.
Okay.
So now, the next area real quick, and I'll get through these quick. The sales tax is real simple. The penny tax on construction has resulted in a massive amount of building as a welfare program to contractors. If you go to the next to last page where it says public enemy number one corporate welfare, the Commercial Real Estate Guide had on its cover back to school work hungry contractors bid for education projects. We cannot afford to have 1/6 to 1/7 of that sales tax dedicated to building solely for the purpose of subsidizing the construction industry, when in many communities it has no tangible benefits. We are literally seeing multi-million-dollar athletic facilities built that, while in school districts that can't afford to pay teachers or buy books. It makes no sense, and yet it has become the defining factor in how our school boards are constructed. Again, it's not just that this is a bad tax. When you dedicate $400 million a year to construction, you get the Iowa School Board Association advocating construction instead of education, and then you get school boards who are being dominated by people who are being elected, not because they will fight to make sure our kids can read, write, and compute, but individuals are supporting school board candidates who will support building and bonding and building and bonding. So whether the tax had value or not, it's changing literally the culture of our school boards. When I got elected to the Des Moines School Board, and this is a matter of public record, our school board members didn't think they were supposed to discuss things like graduation rates, dropout rates, or attendance. Our agenda from when I got elected in September until the end of the calendar year did not have an academic subject on it, and when I brought up academic subjects, they tried to chastise me. Now, that culture got changed before I left because I had a TV show, I was on WHO, I had newspapers, so I had the means to drive a culture change on that board. Most places, school board people don't. So if your school board is spending $20, $30, $40 million a year, or even $10 or $5 million a year, when it comes to the time to elect school boards, you're going to see the building construction trades, realtors, and others. Ankeny, Iowa, one of the fastest growing cities in the state. We had a school board candidate who flat out said, candidates are being supported because they're willing to build schools where developers want to build developments. Well, you know, judge for yourself. But we see that happening all over the state. You have $10 million to spend. You have the ability to bond $50 million. I want you to build a school right in the middle of where I own land so I can build a whole bunch of houses and apartments and other things. Now I'm giving you contributions to get elected to the school board, not because you'll help kids know how to read, write, and compute in a state that now is producing students where only 20% are college prepared, but I'm going to contribute to you because you're going to give me land, or you're going to ask for $118 million like they did in Cedar Falls last month.
So what is your sales tax reform?
1, change the penny sales tax back to a local option. Let local people decide. 2, as we begin reducing the sales tax, as we begin reducing state expenditures, we roll the sales tax back to 4% and eventually 3%. This is one of the most regressive taxes that exists. And it really hurts a lot of people who are living on the margin of that second and third job. Income tax, last area we'll touch on. We actually support phasing that out over 10 years, but the first thing we do with the income tax is we introduce something we call the Every Working Iowa Economic Empowerment Initiative. This is designed to help us get towards that self-sufficiency that allows us to phase out the tax. There are 2 components. 1, eliminating taxation on overtime. If you're working at Hardee's at 3:47 a.m. in Des Moines, 3:47 a.m. in Des Moines, and you have a 2-year-old, a daughter who needs a prom dress and another job at 8, they ought not be taxing your earnings, like that extra earning, so they could then give that money to a Bruce Rastetter who has $100 million in the bank. It's moral, it's indecent, it's vulgar. And you will spend it better when you're working 70, 80, 90 hours a week. Second component is it's a rebate program at 3 levels. 5% of your income tax is rebated so that you can invest it in your community. Not the government. You might invest it in art programs, or music programs, or in Ogden they might have invested in a medical clinic they brought back. It's your choice. 10% into rural development, 15% into any Iowa-based business. Todd could reinvest it in the Reader. Other individuals could pull their money together. This jumpstarts economic revitalization in all 99 communities. So small communities can bring back their grocery stores. We actually would likely see a revitalization of our food-based economy. People think Iowa is a food-growing state. We're not a food-growing state. We grow fuel, we grow feed, and we raise meat. 90% of the food we consume in this state is produced outside of this state. So we start off by saying over a 10-year period, we want to rebate your income tax so that you can begin restarting a free market engine in Iowa. And then after 10 years, we basically make the income tax go away. This would help revitalize urban areas, rural areas. One other thing too in terms of generating revenue, and I rarely call it revenue because it's taxes. Taxes are not revenue, taxes are compelled. But there's one area of revenue that we offer as an alternative to taxation. There's huge talk about raising the gas tax, which will devastate working people, whether they're in Des Moines, like Shannon, who has to go to Ankeny to drop her kid off, then West Des Moines where she works, and then back to Des Moines, or whether it would devastate the young lady who works at the Atlantic newspaper who lives in Audubon, who in surrounding towns they have to go 30 miles to buy groceries. So the gas tax would devastate working people. Terry Branson and Jack Hatch can afford it, but they, I think, can afford a G4 too, so that shouldn't count. One area of revenue we've talked about is generating revenue through legalization of pot. Now, talked about decriminalizing drug use, and that's another area. That would save money. But what we've also talked about is generating revenue through legalization in 3 significant ways. One, I apologize, I thought this was off.
It's $20, by the way. That our union meeting.
I really thought this was off. One, we sell growth permits. So if you want to grow it in your basement, you pay 1 permit. If you want to grow 5,000 acres because you want to bring back the hemp industry, you pay another amount for a permit. Be per acre, whatever. That money would be shared with the local community in which it's grown, the county in which it's grown, and the state. Then we would sell it in state stores. The state would take 25 or 30%. The grower would take 70, 75%. Again, a portion of that will be used for residential property tax relief. Percentage would be used for mental health services, and percentage would go to the state. Now, when I spoke to the Iowa Normal people, they said, well, why would we pay for a permit? So you can get legislative votes to legalize it. Well, it's the same thing with residential property tax relief and mental health services. Buying votes. Not gonna lie about it, that's the real world of politics. Mm-hmm. And then the third thing we do is when we sell it in stores to customers, we tax it. And that would generate a significant amount of money, especially since Iowa is closer than Colorado. And then we use that money to rebuild our roads, our bridges, our infrastructure, clean our waterways, plant some trees. And we do it by paying Iowa's Davis-Bacon wages with good solid benefits, not by sending the money out of state with contractors. This would also generate additional tax revenue through those jobs. It would take people off the welfare rolls, especially when people can now work 1 job and see their kids instead of working 3 jobs and get divorced. The other thing it would do is it would create a hemp industry in Iowa. Hemp is a miracle. Make ropes and paper and lotion and clothes. And you can even make ethanol with it. Ethanol that doesn't force you to then raise the price of a pound of bacon or a pound of hamburger at the grocery store. So that would also be a source of generating additional revenue, which then allows us to reduce costs. Now, if we reduce Medicaid by 50%, we save $1.8 billion for taxpayers and $700 to $800 million for Iowa taxpayers. So this is our approach or vision to tax reform. One other area that we originally had introduced but sort of took off because it was just a political quagmire, still think it's a good idea, is a voluntary tax structure. There are certain agencies in government, Department of Cultural Affairs, museums, where you ought to be able to, as a taxpayer, say, you know what, I'd like to write a check. Especially for those individuals who feel compelled that we should have high taxes. Well, you know what, we're not going to have high taxes for the rest of us, but if you really, really think it's a great idea, write out $1 million check to that school district to pay for that weight room. Think that weight room's a great idea? Give it to the government. You don't have to give it to a charity. Allow a voluntary tax structure. So if people want to pay more, they can. But again, we kind of dropped that just because that just seems so confusing to so many people. It was literally just a political quagmire. And yes, ma'am.
On your chart up there, you have cigarette tax and
Tobacco tax.
And aren't they the same?
No, ma'am.
So what's
Cigarette tax is a tax on cigarette. Tobacco tax is a tax on things like chew.
Pipe tobacco.
Okay.
Mhm.
Pipe.
Cigars.
Yeah, cigars, pipe, chew.
Your taxes too
Well, John, anybody have any questions for John on tax reform? Then we can do,
high. I like the idea about the hemp. We really do because of what you said before, but do you realize the opposition you're gonna get from the corporate side for the idea of bringing hemp back, because hemp is basically illegal?
Well, you know, one of the things I like about my running mate, he took on Archer Daniels Midland and Cargill. He invented this thing called soy wax and he won it. He's a living example that even the biggest corporations in the world, and Archer Daniels Midland used to just buy legislators like other folks buy packs of chewing gum, you know.
Well, I'm talking about you're gonna start fighting the Koch brothers too, because the
So?
reason why hemp got in it, you know, because one of the stories that I read from a progressive liberal historian teacher was that when the Navy wanted to use rope, it used to be made on hemp, and then a certain company out east found a way they could make plastic out of it, and they've spent a lot of money in doing so far. They're called DuPont.
Sure,
And
absolutely.
yeah, you're gonna take on a lot of people with the oil-based industry, because it goes into a lot of stuff that hemp can be used for that oil is made with now.
You know, when I got elected to the school board, and granted it's not the state, but Polk County is the most corrupt place in Iowa. I think the corruption in Polk County probably rivals that of some other places like Cook County.
Probably.
But it is a cesspool. The Des Moines School Board was the most powerful and treasure protected division of local government. Now, truths that we exposed not only created reforms, but we saw an individual like John Klein go to prison. Some folks literally died over there. It is a corrupt, vile place on the face of the earth. And when I went into the school board with seemingly no support, people doubted that we could get reforms. Now, the day before I got elected, a list was made by a local radio show host, J. Michael McCoy, of the things I said I would get done. And the day I got less than 2 years later, even though they tried to prosecute me, sue me, I got death threats, every single thing got checked off. Now, I was Polk County Democratic co-chair at the age of 20 years old. I couldn't even legally drink, but my first real meeting wasn't a central committee meeting, it was in the Hotel Savory, when they had 2 items on the agenda. First was selecting the next mayor. People actually thought that the voters did that. And then the second was telling Archie Brooks, if he didn't back off running against Jack Bishop, Archie was a city councilman, that they would destroy him by exposing his affair with Ramona Cunningham. Well, they did, but they didn't realize that the executive director of an agency called CTEC was having an affair with his administrative assistant. So it sort of trumped Archie's. Now, Archie was corrupt and evil in many respects, and I told Archie he was going to end up in jail. 20 years later, 2006, 2005, 2006, Archie ended up going to prison along with Ramona Cunningham, along with Jane Bardo, the lady who introduced me to vitamin C pills, by the way, great contribution to my health, and a host of others. Dan Albritton, who headed the unions, they all were rounded up and went to prison. Later than they should have. But they ended up in prison. Now, when I got to the school board, my first week on the board, I stopped them from selling a $60+ million piece of property for $2.9 million to a downtown developer. I exposed a contractor who was billing us for time that didn't exist. He had a $20 million contract at the time. It was in line for $50 million due to this change in the penny law, and now he's punching a time clock. Corruption is a lot easier to fight than virtue that comes with cowardice. It's not hard fighting corruption because they have to have a tight-knit circle of individuals who are vowed to begin with. They don't trust each other, and at the first sign of trouble, they are apt to bail or turn on each other. The problems with securing change is that you have people who sit around, who know that change needs to be made, believe in change, and don't have the heart or courage to make it. So this is why we're creating an Iowa party, because we don't need huge masses of individuals who are ready to charge out on the battlefield and then pee on themselves like the dude did in Gladiator. We need individuals who understand that with leverage, you can create change. We're talking about creating a political party that with a minimal amount of effort can say no to billions of dollars of attempts to snatch money when we're not looking. That has the power to say, you're fired, Mr. Judge. To say to school boards, you don't get to elect people anymore because they're going to vote you money. Now, that doesn't take lots of numbers. If it didn't, I mean, that's why we're not focusing on the president. It takes lots of numbers to guarantee electing a president. It doesn't take lots of numbers to stop them from stealing at the school board level. So the problem with creating change is that people often lack strategies for change. Here's what people do today. They go, if I educate these people, they will do the right thing. And then they go, oh, they're not doing the right thing. I need to go get more information, okay? No, they're sold out. They know exactly what they're doing. They're sold out. And if they're not sold out, they still ought to know better. And what you have to say to a politician is, if you're not going to do the right thing, we are going to vote you out of office, period. We're going to fire you. That's what you do to people who do a bad job. Since it's not legal to kill them, which our founders would have done. I'm not advocating that, by the way. I'm just saying, George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Paine, they would have been, they said, who needs to die in order to fix this? I'm not saying that. I'm saying you get to live, you just don't get to be on the school board no more. You just don't get to be on the city council no more. And with this mechanism, we have the ability to ensure that that happens. How do we know? Because we've already done it. In fact, the Iowa party doesn't even need to exist for us to vote bad people out of office. It needs to exist so that when we elect people, we can hold them accountable. That was the missing mechanism before. We didn't have a way of preventing people from turning into things that were worse than what we were getting rid of. That's what the Iowa party allows us to do, to hold ourselves accountable.